and New Year's Eve with you and Tom and all the wonderful people assembled, and thank you for that.
Well, thanks so much. It was wonderful having you and all the wonderful people that you brought. A lot of the regulars at our party are also regulars at your party.
Yeah, there seems to be that. And welcome very much to Conversations. A great personal pleasure and honor to welcome to the program Polly Cleveland, PhD. She's billed here as an environmental economist, and she'll share with us. Perhaps she just got back from a meeting of the Major Association of Economists, 12,000 of them meeting in San Francisco in these first days of 2009. But welcome, Polly, very, very much. It's really a pleasure to welcome you to the set.
Thanks so much, Harold.
Let's start off with you, okay? Your background, if you could share with us a little bit, born and raised, education, and so forth. And I know you have a Georgia's take on things economic, but could you share your own background, and then we'll talk about the state of the economy and that sort of thing.
Okay, sure. I was born in Washington, D.C., Foreign Service family. So, as I say, I grew up abroad.
Yes.
Started out in Romania and then in Paris for 4 years, back in the U.S., then in Australia, Thailand, and by the time I went to college, my parents were in former Yugoslavia, so I went out for the summers and for Christmas.
What a wonderful education you were getting,
well,
in terms of the moving around, right? With your father, your mother was in the service?
Well, my father was Foreign Service. Back in those days, a Foreign Service wife was a job in itself. So my mother entertained, and my father diplomated.
I really have a great respect for the Foreign Service. I think you got an awful lot of really caring and intelligently tuned-in people within the Foreign Service, seems to me. Your dad was in that position. He was like at consular offices, or?
Yeah, well, he was an economic officer.
Okay.
Which means, I guess, he dealt with trade and treaties and stuff like that. I mean, I was never totally clear on what he did. But he was a naval officer during World War II. He was actually in London during some of the bombing.
Wow.
And he was very much interested in public service. And so when he got the chance, the Foreign Service had been completely shut down for a number of years. But when it started taking people again after World War II, he joined.
Now, the educational process, I assume you had a great deal of education gleaned at some of those social functions and around the dinner table, is the case when you're in that kind of a situation as far as education writ large. But formally, at the less than university level, you went to various schools and that kind of thing, and you were moving around.
I mean, in Paris, I actually went to a school, a French-speaking school. Not so in Thailand. I went to the American school in Bangkok. And then, of course, I went to college. But I mean, I grew up speaking at least some French and German, because in France we had a Swiss-German nanny. So at least at a younger age, I was completely trilingual, which is it's a good asset. I learned a lot of languages after that. It just makes it easy to learn languages if you grow up with a bunch of them.
It does indeed, and you're learning at your mother's knee, more or less, or like osmosis. You can just pick it up when you're young, and we're learning like crazy when we're just infants or young, and that sort of thing. I think there's something like 5,000 languages. I once met a fellow in Turkey. I was hitchhiking through as a young man, and he was an Armenian, had been born in Iran, and had then gone on business in Europe, and he was speaking to me in idiomatic English. And he said that he could speak 24 languages, you know. He said the more you have, the easier it is, which is kind of interesting. I don't know how many languages one brain system could handle, but it's just kind of interesting that, as you say, you pick up one, the others come much easier.
Well, it just becomes easier to learn how to learn a language.
Yeah, right. Anyway, well, congratulations on that. Now, how about the education? Did you go to what would be like comparable to high school or grammar school in England or something?
No, I went to high school in the U.S. Actually, it was a girls' school, which my mother and grandmother had gone to.
I see.
So I was interested in science, but it was kind of low on science. It was more of a finishing school. It isn't anymore, the Holton Arms School. It's improved.
Is it still in place?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
It's like a prep school.
Yeah, it's a prep school. And then I went to Radcliffe, where my mother had gone. So,
okay, yeah. A legacy
That's sort of a legacy, I guess.
Okay.
But
yeah.
I mean, I hope I pulled my own weight
I'm
academically.
sure I know for a fact that you did do that.
So
dear.
I was.
Yeah.
I started out as a math major, and then I became a biochemistry major, and then I ended up as a physics major. So you know.
Biochemistry makes me think of Tom Haynes.
Yeah. Well, that was.
Maybe a little bit later
that
down
was
the line.
Later down the line.
Yeah.
That was. But then I started graduate school in ancient Near Eastern languages.
Boy, you seem to have a lot of wide-ranging interests. You're interested in science and language and that sort of thing, and doing that.
I'm a real dilettante.
Well, dilettante is a derogatory term, I think. And other than that, I mean, like, for instance, as you're well aware from our association over the years, I was very much influenced by Buckminster Fuller.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't call himself a dilettante because he wasn't specializing in something. He called himself a comprehensivist. And you seem to have a very wide-ranging interest, and that's particularly appropriate, too, in a world of systems and pattern recognizing of systems that are all interconnected. So you were ahead of the curve, perhaps, in terms of the educational the best educational procedure by which a human being might be able to proceed in the world.
Well, I don't know. I spent 2 summers on an excavation in Israel.
Did you?
This was the excavation at Tel Gezer, which is on the old Jerusalem road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And that was a lot of fun.
Sidebar: Are you in line with with Grover Cleveland, our president? Or your family?
I think I'm a descendant of a brother or something. I'm not quite sure where that fits in.
Mm-hmm.
There's also some Adamses back there, so...
I understand that from talk with Tom that you might be going back to John Quincy Adams, perhaps.
Some Adams back there. Again, it's not something that has ever interested me enough to check it out thoroughly.
You're not narcissistic enough, I think, perhaps.
Well,
you got to develop a little more
important.
of the Stephen Colbert in you, you know.
Well, I mean, I married Tom. Tom came from the other side of the tracks,
yeah.
And you know, grew up in an orphanage.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe in opportunity for all. But at the same time, I am aware that I have had some spectacular opportunities myself, and there's a certain obligation to give back when you've been so privileged.
Yeah, absolutely. That's true. That's a very, I don't want to say noblesse oblige, but it just is true, and there's nature of things. And
well, that's very much my father. You know, felt an obligation to society. I mean, of course, he grew up during the Depression and with, I think, a lot more social consciousness than the average person. So he felt an obligation to public service, and I think conveyed that to some degree to his children. So, because the next step in my career was I went with my ex-husband and worked for Ralph Nader.
Oh, good.
First in Washington, D.C., and then in California, and this was a project. It was called the Power and Land in California project, and power was not electric power.
Yeah.
It had to do with power of large landowners to get public works projects directed their way. In particular, the big one was the California State Water Project, which ran water down the west side of the San Joaquin Valley, where the land was desert or close to desert, occupied by a handful of huge landowners. And the trick of a water project like this is you build it well in advance of need. I mean, it was sold to the state on the grounds that Los Angeles would dry up and blow away without additional water. But surprise, you know, they built this water project 50 years in advance.
Wow.
And so the of need or of ever need. And so, you know, a bonanza to these large landowners on the west side of the Central Valley.
West side,
West side,
right,
because the east side was already developed by the Bureau of Reclamation.
I see, okay.
And there were small or relatively small farmers subject to the 160-acre limitation. That is 160 acres per family to get subsidized water. But on the west side, no limitation, so these great big huge landowners
gobbled it up.
And then they're getting the water and developing the land.
160 acres, that's what was allowed under the good old Homestead Act of 1962 and so forth,
But to get subsidized irrigated water, it was 160 acres per person, so 640 acres, a square mile per
Right, right.
four-person family.
Right.
But these people on like the Tejon Ranch and Standard Oil of California had tens of thousands of acres, and and they got all of this cheap water. So anyway, that
50
was,
years in advance.
Yeah.
And Lake Mead and the Hoover Dam and the water that it feeds the Imperial Valley and that is in place or not or need not be, or how does that fit in?
There's a wonderful old book called Cadillac Desert about how a lot of these water projects never would have passed a benefit cost test. They were boondoggles, and the oldest way to get rich in this country is to buy nearly worthless land in the middle of nowhere and then have someone bring roads or water or railroads to it. I mean, that's how great fortunes are made.
Even it could have been, yeah.
And I was talking this morning to Congressman Bill Foster, who took over Denny Hastert's district, and it turns out that Denny Hastert played the same game, which is he bought land and then got earmarked highways built to his land, suddenly making the land valuable.
Yeah, right.
And it's the oldest game in the U.S.
or the world.
Public works for private enrichment.
Sid Greenfield, I don't know if you know him, he's one of your colleagues up at Columbia. He's an anthropologist, a tremendous scholar, had studied with Carl Wittfogel, had written on, going back into history, Oriental despotism, and that the irrigation systems in Mesopotamia were required, and that sociological and political processes followed. Water is very, very important consideration. Let's back up just a little bit. You did some education at the university level in economics? Or how did you get to economics?
No, I graduated from college as a physics major. I almost finished a degree in ancient Near Eastern languages, first at Harvard Graduate School, and then I transferred to Berkeley Graduate School in ancient Near Eastern languages. And
two very good schools.
Yeah. No, I had a wonderful time. Reading clay tablets. I can write your name. I can write your name in cuneiform.
Can you really? Let's do that. Make a little thing.
Yeah, I'd have to go look it up now as to how to do it. But it was a syllabary. It wasn't that hard to decipher. But I sort of got the public interest bug, and while working on the Nader report in California, this was 1970. I came across some Georgists, that is, admirers of the great American economist Henry George, and I read George's classic Progress and Poverty, which was written in 1879, and was enormously influential in the last part of the 19th century.
Absolutely, yeah.
And in fact, Nader was aware of this, and he had already hooked some of the land and power project people up with the local Georgists who were interested in, the giveaway of
land,
public resources.
Yeah, giveaway of public resources. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you take, you make desert land valuable by building a water project. Well, that's the so-called unearned increment.
Yeah.
And the solution to that is, of course, to tax the land so that you get the public money back.
Okay, that's getting into some of the details of a George's take on things.
Yeah.
Ralph Nader has great integrity, it seems to me. He fights the battle and fights, and he's always there if we can repair to and everything. Great admiration for him, and you did as well.
Yeah.
But did you do academic studies in economics or not?
Oh, yeah. Then I decided that to drop out of dead languages. And so I entered the School of Agricultural Economics, and this was the Giannini Foundation. There's two economics departments at UC Berkeley. There's the regular economics department, and then the Agricultural Economics Department, which has now renamed itself the Agricultural and Resource Economics. They're sort of trying to get with it. But it's actually a very good department because it has concentrated increasingly on development economics. So you get a lot of people from Latin America especially coming there for degrees in economics. And so that's where I got my PhD there.
In economics as a whole, or did you specialize within that, or what was your paper about?
Well, I did my dissertation on Consequences and Causes of Unequal Distribution of Wealth. You know,
Wonderful.
That's the title.
Wonderfully.
And,
yeah.
And this is 400 pages of equations showing why unequal distribution of wealth is bad for the economy and bad for economic growth.
Absolutely. We just aired a program here in Manhattan yesterday, done way back in 1987 with Ravi Batra. He had written a book on and saying that unequal distribution of wealth, particularly, but also income, was the cause of what he said we were heading for in the year 1990, and which some people are thinking we may yet be heading for, is a Great Depression beyond even the Depression of the 1930s. So that's there. One little sidebar again, then we'll get into it.
Yeah.
The Georges thing and everything, because it's very important, I know, and I want to understand it and learn. But Green Revolution, Norman Borlaug, and that sort of thing, were you interested in that or not? Or is that off base from where your interest was?
Well, it's not anything I have done too much work on. I mean, some of it has been very good. Some of it was, you know, some of it never worked because it really was excessively capital intensive. You know, they developed these wonderful miracle strains of grains and put them out there with poor peasants who couldn't get the fertilizers, pesticides, and other complementary inputs to go with them, and so they went nowhere.
Seeds, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, so you know, in some cases it worked very well, in some cases it didn't. But that's not really my.
That was a sidebar. Okay. Well, then why don't we jump right in, because you became interested, and you still are, and I'm associating you with the field of economics, and particularly Henry George. Maybe you could introduce him to the audience and what his basic theme and thesis was. And in 1879, you're talking in turn of the century, 19th, 20th century, but his ideas are still relevant in terms of the current situation. Maybe you could share in a nutshell. In a
very small nutshell.
Yeah.
Yeah, George was an American. He was self-educated, you know, unlike the British, sort of the beginning of the British economics profession. And he traveled around the world, and his observation in America, he spent some time as a publisher in San Francisco, and his observation was that as cities became richer, they also became less equal.
Okay.
And because land values increased, and the folks who had the land got richer, and the folks who didn't have land got poorer, not necessarily absolutely, but relatively poorer. So he said, aha, you know, distribution is affected by growth in land values.
Distribution of income.
Distribution of income, or distribution of
wealth,
too.
Yeah,
wealth,
right.
you know, wealth is you know,
more
your
basic.
assets at one point. Income is a stream of services and goods that you're entitled to.
A claim on it,
Yeah, a claim. So, so in any case, and he studied the classical economists like, Adam Smith and David Ricardo in particular.
Marshall?
And Marshall was late post-George. Marshall was writing around the turn of the century.
Do we branch Marshall in with the classical paradigm?
Yeah, Alfred Marshall is sort of the end of the classicals.
Okay, yeah.
But George and of course John Stuart Mill, and now Henry George corresponded with John Stuart Mill, who very much said some of the same things about land. You know, the famous Mill quote is that landowners grow richer, as it were, in their sleep without working or laboring or something like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, why should they be entitled to
unearned income?
To unearned income. I wish I could remember the exact Mill quote. But in any case, George corresponded.
John Stuart Mill was something else.
John Stuart Mill was a very radical guy.
He was also very brilliant.
Yeah. And but George took Mill one better. Mill said you should, George's remedy, or Mill's remedy too, is that the public should tax land values.
Okay.
And the values of all natural resources, because these ultimately belong to the public. The public creates their value, tax them back. Smith says that to some extent too. I mean, Smith says, you know, landowners enjoy their property under the protection of the government. They owe something back. So this was...
So that's land, not only land in the sense of 160 acres, that's also the resources, or...
It's the title. It's the title, the property. It's the property right, really, you're talking about.
Okay, but what I'm getting at in a certain sense is that that the natural resource base, the air, the water, the land, that is given as the human society comes on the scene, as it were, evolutionarily, is something unique and should be seen as something unique that ought to be the ownership of which, or the access to, or the improvement in their life, as it were, should be for everybody in a certain way, unique from either what capital claims or labor claims. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's sort of getting at it.
Okay.
That the natural resources of the world, you know, the sun, the heavens, and ultimately belong to us all. And how obviously we have to have private titles to things, because you can't function if everybody can run over your land.
Yeah.
But you can have private titles, and at the same time you can have the unearned income from those titles returned to the public in the form of taxes.
But that's a major premise, then.
And you know, we gave away all, billions worth of broadcast spectrum to the broadcast companies.
Yeah.
Well, a Georgist would say those broadcast companies should be paying us something back, whether it's rent or taxes. They should be paying us something back for the privilege that we have given them of the exclusive right to use a particular piece of spectrum.
Gotcha. I don't want to be nitpicking or anything, but the broadcast spectrum was of no. I mean, it was there. I mean, if you look at Homo sapien 200,000 years ago, we were born into a world with a lot of resources and things around, but it didn't have any meaning until there was a liaison with the technology that made it useful in a way that it wasn't. Seems to me the broadcast spectrum didn't have any meaning economically until we reached a certain point in terms of the technological input. So we managed to think natural resource base should be collectively owned or by everyone, and that's interesting. But where do you make the distinction when you're having to come into association with either some capital instrument or labor's application or human input to a productive process that utilize the natural resource base that we come? We had oil for millions of years, but until we had an internal combustion engine, it didn't work. All those are elementary questions, but I'm just curious.
No, but absolutely. I mean, of course, the broadcast spectrum wasn't valuable until Marconi invented the radio and all of that.
Yeah. But
the point is, it was the society as a whole that made the broadcast spectrum valuable. And you can always separate there's a market for spectrum. You know what it's worth. Quite apart from all of the capital equipment that's used to operate it, to actually send out the signals to build the towers, that's capital. But the title, the property right that is enforced by the federal government, that says that you have the exclusive right to broadcast at a certain wattage from a certain location at a certain frequency, that's a title that's given to you and protected by the government.
Right.
And that's the same as, Tom and I have 2 little buildings on a plot of land in a nice location. Well, it's the society that gives us the title to that property, to that location, and without society it wouldn't be valuable.
Okay. Now, then back again to the major premise that the natural resources should be the purview or in the effective association with the people. The natural resource base of the world, land and a natural air, water, these kind of things should be, in a certain sense, am I wrong? It's owned by everybody.
It should be.
It has a unique status.
It has a unique status. You can give out. Let me give you an example in the environmental area. We're worried about carbon dioxide.
Yeah, now we
excessive carbon dioxide causing global warming.
Yeah.
And there are 3 approaches that we can take to limiting carbon dioxide. We can, of course, regulate the producers of carbon dioxide. Nobody's really doing that. Or we can have permits for emission of carbon dioxide.
Carbon tax.
Well, you see, there are two ways to do it.
Oh.
Either you can say, okay, we're going to allow just so much emission of carbon dioxide, and we're going to make the emitters bid for it. That is, pay to get permits to emit carbon dioxide, which is one way to do it, in which case that's making them pay for the right to dump carbon dioxide into our shared atmosphere. Or what's happening now, unfortunately, is we're giving the polluters the right to dump carbon dioxide in proportion to their past history of pollution.
Could I make a point? The Montreal Protocol against what was it? Fluorocarbohydrates, or things that were eroding the ozone layer.
Yeah.
Came effectively to be recognized by our political and economic leadership, and they seem to have been able to address that issue effectively in the commonweal, the interest of the commonweal, right? You say the carbon thing, or the global warming.
The sulfur dioxide was handled by giving a limited amount of emission rights to the existing polluters. That is, what we did was, instead of making them buy the right to emit sulfur dioxide, we gave them the rights and said, okay, you trade, but among you.
Now, what would have George have thought of that?
Well, George would have said that you should rent or lease the rights to pollute to the highest bidder. That would be the Georgist thing, to say that the use of the atmosphere as a dump for pollution. The atmosphere belongs to all of us. Now,
okay, that's the thing.
And therefore, if we are going to allow people to use the atmosphere to dump waste, or the rivers for that matter, the polluters should pay. Not that the polluters should be given the right to pollute and then we have to pay them not to.
And this is, again, I'm trying to get it nailed down if I could, because you understand, I like Lewis Kelso, you know that.
Yeah, I know that.
But the thing is that, so you're getting down to where there's a popular song, "The world belongs to everyone." There is a level at which the world and its resource base belongs to everybody, which would be a premise that George's view would want to have as a major premise in terms of the way we're going to organize ourselves, right? As opposed to, let's just say, Karl Marx or Friedman or Keynes or something like that. They don't make that distinction. Does that set George apart from the economic canon?
Marx and George are in some ways very similar in at least in the way they looked at the origin of problems of poverty and distribution.
Yeah.
But, I mean, Marx never really had a solution. He just had sort of an analysis of the... I won't go into... I mean, I greatly admire Marx. But
yeah, he's a great sociologist, for sure.
But a different...
Era.
different... well, no, I mean, Marx and George knew of each other. Marx didn't think much of George. He thought George was trying to save the capitalist system by tax reform, and he wanted to abolish it altogether. Anyway, but that's a sort of
that's a
issue.
large theme in human history and so forth. Yeah.
But the thing is, you have to have to make an economy work. You have to have private titles to natural resources.
Private titles to natural resources? No. Private title, if I may, Colleen. Private title to natural resource. What I'm trying to say, it seems to me George has a different attitude toward what would be called natural resource, or the given environment, as opposed to, let's say, private title to a piece of land that you own, or a capital instrument, or even your right to have fair return for your labor input to production, which seems to fit more into the canon, as I understand it, from Smith to Friedman, is that you've got labor and you've got capital instruments, and everything other than labor can be owned, and that there's a dialectic there. But George brings in another consideration of the natural resource base, which is the property, if that's the right term, of us all. Am I off base or not?
Well, the classical economists always had three so-called factors of production: land, labor, and capital.
They did?
Yeah. Oh, they did. You bet. And
land,
so George,
labor.
Land, labor, and by land they meant all natural resources, just like George. George is very much a classical economist.
So in the feudal era, where they had fiefs and that kind of thing, they would have that concept prior to Smith and everything, but the idea of land, which was obviously like in a feudal system, is very much the base of an agricultural society and so forth. They recognized that.
Yeah, the physiocrats, the French physiocrats,
Yeah, right,
from whom Adam Smith learned a great deal.
Yeah.
So, you know, the classical view of economics, and George is very much a classical economist.
Okay.
You had land, labor, and capital, and land meaning all natural resources, and capital is sort of stored up labor and land.
Congealed capital, the Marxists call it, yeah.
So
because they are informed by a labor theory of value.
A labor theory of value, which George got from Ricardo.
Okay.
Which Marx got the labor. Marx got the labor theory of value from Ricardo. George
as well
rejected
as comparative advantage.
Right.
Yeah.
George rejected the labor theory of value.
He did.
And
okay.
he was the first to have a marginal theory of value, and his marginal theory of value.
Utility?
No, marginal. He said that wages are determined by, in his terms, what a man can earn by himself working on freely available land.
Okay.
In other words, in other words, he's saying if you have, as you have in Latin America, large landowners owning the best land, the central land, the wages are going to be determined by what peasants can scratch out on an eroding hillside.
Yeah. Yeah,
and
the
so he's saying
the
distribution of land affects wages. The more unequally distributed the land is, the lower the wages are going to be, because the wages are tied to what people can make on land that is freely available, marginal land. This is partly also in Ricardo.
Yeah, does that refer particularly to latifundista or plantation and agricultural feudal systems of organization, as opposed to stressing the land in the sense of an actual piece of acreage, as opposed to all resources, that sort of thing?
Well, I mean, an example is, as you said, the latifundistas are the large Latin American landowners.
Oh.
They own the best land, the most centrally located land, the flat land, and what do? Mostly they graze cattle.
That's what they did in Mesopotamia, too, when they brought in irrigation. Karl Wittfogel, it was the basis of Oriental despotism, but that's another side.
That's
that goes way back to the days of the cuneiform.
Well, I studied that at one point.
I
but
suppose you were. Were you familiar with Karl Wittfogel?
No, I wasn't.
Okay, you want to maybe be, but I'm sorry, I got you steered away.
But in any case, what is very plainly visible in Latin America where the best land is occupied and used at very low intensity. They'll graze cattle on the good land, and then you will see the peasants up on the hillsides, scratching out little plots. And if you look at some of the agricultural statistics, most of the food supplied comes from the small farms, not from the big ones.
That's interesting in the contemporary. It was also the situation in King John's England, I think, or in feudal Europe. I mean, it was sort of the same, too. The peasants were wallowing around in the bogs or something, and the land was owned by the lords.
But the point is, if you have poor peasants, they will work much harder, even if they're not on as good land, because that's all they've got.
Yeah, it's called survival, right?
Yeah. So,
and generally, history is. Could I use the line James Joyce said, "History is a nightmare from which I'm attempting to awaken." It seems to me that it's always been like that in terms of what would be called justice. It's never been just. It's always been a few that have the power to commandeer the resources and have the masses under their sway.
Well, I mean, that has varied in varying degrees. So, but since you mentioned history, let me bring up an important piece of history at
There's
this point.
There's a lot of it.
But which is something that as we contemplate this economic mess that we are falling into, what most people don't know, even most economists that I was talking to, is that during the Roaring '20s there was a monster real estate bubble.
Was there? I didn't realize.
Yeah, most people don't.
Yeah, okay.
And this was a result of the automobile, and all of a sudden, all sorts of land that would not previously have been suitable for housing became suitable for housing, as the private automobile gave people the flexibility,
freedom to move,
to move, to get out of town.
Absolutely, away from those ports on the rivers.
And so what happened, there was an absolute speculative frenzy of subdividing all around the big cities. And people were out there buying their plots of land, planning to move out there or to hold them for speculation. And I've seen some figures that around cities that enough land was at least platted, if not developed, to house, triple the population of the U.S. at that time. So
right.
it was just a absolutely incredible speculative bubble.
In real estate, yeah.
In real estate.
Yeah,
And what happened, it sort of peaked around 26.
Okay.
And then began going down, and real estate values were already on their way down come the crash of 29.
Like the thing we've seen over these last few months? In that dimension, that high?
And
amazing.
And what happened was that real estate housing construction just stopped. And it didn't really pick up again until after World War II.
Boy, oh boy, yeah.
And so, the construction industry was just wiped out because there was much too much construction, and then there was just a tremendous waste of resources because just as has happened now, people made a lot of bad investments. They stopped saving. They bought real estate parcels which turned out to have no value. And then to make matters worse, all these subdivisions were laid out, and they were often badly laid out, but they were occupying good locations next to the major cities, and so now they became an obstacle to building new housing because you had these messed up subdivisions, some of which were never even intended to be developed. They were just sort of a fraud, like underwater lots in Florida. But I saw one figure that around Detroit, where this frenzy really went crazy.
That's where I was drug up.
Yeah. Okay. Around Detroit, somebody did a survey of the housing subdivisions that had been built, and they found that by 1937, 90% of the lots were still vacant.
Ah, really? Yeah.
And that gives you, and this was just all over the country, not just in Florida.
So the Great Depression of 1930 or whatever it is, the Great Depression was presaged, as it were, by a housing bubble?
A housing bubble.
Bursting of a housing bubble?
The bursting of a huge housing bubble. And of course, what the housing bubble does, just as it's done here, is it pulls down the banks. Because the banks had in fact, the banks financed a lot of this bubble.
Sure, yeah, right.
Just in the 20s, just like they did now in, over the last 10 years. And of course, the real estate values collapse, the collateral collapses, the banks start to call in their loans and stop making more loans, and then the banks start to go under. Yeah,
it was terrible. It was just terrible conditions that exist for so many people, 25, 30% unemployment for decades. And it was a terrible thing, the Great Depression. And let me just ask a sidebar in a way.
Yeah.
Do you think and that was worldwide,
to
the degree there was interconnection and so forth. Do you think there's a possibility of a massive, we've done a lot in between, securities exchange and that kind of stuff, a lot of things. A lot of the attention of good-minded citizens of the world were concentrated very, very much on how the hell can we avoid that to happening again after the Second World War. How are we, or in the period coming up, Bretton Woods and all that.
Right.
How can we deal with Mr. Keynes and that? But is there a chance that there could be, do you think, the things Mr. Paulson and Bernanke and so forth are doing, that we could suffer a gigantic runaway deflationary Great Depression as we did in 1929, or maybe even one that is worse? Ravi Batra said they go in cycles 30, 60 years, and we might be coming up to a Great Depression that makes the Depression of 1929 look relatively benign.
Well,
what is your thought?
I think it can get pretty bad, because there's been just one of the things a bubble does is it encourages a lot of wasted investment. People stop saving and they invest in a lot of things, including the auto industry, building big cars. Well, nobody's going to want big cars again for years, and So there's just a tremendous amount of destruction due to this bad investment. And the same thing that happened in the 20s. All sorts of land gets platted for development and then never actually developed. Well, that's an enormous waste of capital.
Yeah, we have a tremendous capability that we're not able to realize.
Well, we've got a tremendous capability to build things that nobody's going to want. I mean,
but don't
it's
we
very
also
hard
have
to reverse that.
Yeah, but don't we also have, if I may, Polly, if you look at things in an abstract sense, we have a tremendous technologically augmented capability to provide what my hero Bucky Fuller would have called livingery. That is, that we're increasing our ability to have an effect on things. And if I may do another sidebar, these are all sidebar things. I've done a lot of studies about the extended, the power, the existentially significant increase in the ability of human activity, or human thinking, intellectual and physical input to the process and thinking. It is such that we reached a point after 200,000 years, much of that has gone toward weaponry, so that a political entity can gain advantage and steal the grain from somebody else for their own tribe and that kind of thing. And that the weaponry now, apparently, I think it should be out in the public, whether it is the case, that if there was a miscalculation by our leaders, look what's going on in Gaza, Kashmir, that sort of thing, and there was an unleashing of the weapon systems, unlike all of history, it would apparently mean the end of our entire species. The weapon systems are that Promethean in a way that is unique. It was not the case as recently as the Second World War. We were protected in our impotence at our ability to kill each other.
Yeah.
Now, on the other side, the existential side, equally significant, we have a capability of providing for, with good design and with the capability that's emerging, a model of the internet might be one we could repair to or something, but to provide for everybody in an equally significant equation. On the living side, we could provide for people within the knowledge base and our technological capability to where we would have an equally existentially significant alteration in our capability. It's all at the level of capability. We have a capability collectively that we don't have a system that allows us to realize, because we're caught up within a paradigm of old thinking out of history, which has been transcended by the new existential reality. Yeah, can you follow that or not?
Not entirely, but as to what is likely to happen. I mean, I think we have the capacity to provide much better social safety nets for the people at the bottom.
And we have we now? We got Social Security.
And I hope that we will. I don't think that Paulson and company are on the right track.
You do not?
I don't think. I mean, definitely we need some public spending, but you know, spending on infrastructure, some infrastructure, yes.
Always,
repairing the cities, repairing the streets and the water mains and the stuff in the cities. But infrastructure often means, you know, building new roads for Denny Hastert, and I'm
earmarks to bridges to nowhere.
And I am worried that Obama is not going to have enough control to prevent that kind of thing. On the other hand, this idea of massive deficits, well,
huge.
You know,
I mean, unbelievable deficits. Unbelievable.
I mean, deficit spending is valuable only if you are clearly putting the money into an investment that's going to pay
for itself.
That's going to pay for itself. If not, you're just draining the economy. And the problem is, if the government borrows a lot of money from the banks, the banks are perfectly happy to sit there and hold government bonds, but that means that the banks are even more going to stop lending to business, especially small business. And small business creates most of the jobs.
Well, then that's repairing back to, and you said George was, back to, and my contention would be, for whatever it's worth, is that the enemy of rational thinking on this planet is an adherence to the labor theory of value that seems to me to inform virtually all of the economic canon, with a possible exception of my man Lewis Kelso, who would have set that aside, that the source of input to production is increasingly through time less and less. The labor input is less and less. And to distribute all income to people through jobs or through their labor participation is what's going to get us into trouble. Yet that's the only thing Mr. Obama's coming up with, how we're going to have distribution of income to the people in a situation where the actual production is increasingly technology. Rand study said there's probably 98% of the production is nothing to do with labor input, but the labor theory and value and the Employment Act of 1946, we're going to distribute income only through labor, and that's a problem philosophically in terms of that got us here. I'm sorry, I'm ranting
I
now,
think,
and
I mean...
That's why I like Louis Kelso, who says we should distribute it. We should have simulfinancing where you have capital formation and income distribution in sync, so that there's building ownership into the people as a way to be able to clear the market. The supply and demand should be in tandem with one another. And
well, now if you're talking about ownership of the people, now that's going back to George. I don't know or really understand Kelso's theory, but one way to have ownership is ownership of cooperatives. I spent a summer in Bologna studying Italian cooperatives, and some of them work very well, and the workers do share and own. And I think under many circumstances, cooperatives are a great idea, and they are sort of Georgist in the sense that you have the shared ownership.
What about in Mondragon or the thing in Barcelona?
I don't know enough. I've heard about the Mondragon. I don't know enough about it.
The anarchists will sing the praises of that era, or that approach, or that movement.
But in any case, in terms of what wants to be done for the economy now, I think it's not a good idea to run up all that deficit spending, and I would start by cutting all the pork in the military.
Yes, well, a good idea. Let's get the hell out of Iraq, for one thing.
Well, I mean, even if it takes a while to wind down Iraq and Afghanistan, a great deal of military spending is just pure pork for the military-industrial complex.
I think it's only about 4.9% of gross national product, I think.
Well,
it's been much higher in other periods.
But there's and then at the local level there is local part, namely roads that we don't really need for the benefit of influential landowners at the state level. So there's a tremendous amount of very wasteful spending. That is spending that generates very little employment. And it's mostly a form of distributing, benefits. Earmarks. Well, there is a very good book I would recommend called Free Lunch by David K. Johnson. And he was speaking at the American Economic Association, but he's a reporter on taxation for the New York Times. So it's called Free Lunch, and it's about all the many and various ways that the system is jiggered to distribute goodies up to the top of the heap. And he had an earlier book called Perfectly Legal. Again, the same thing, that the system is rigged in so many ways to distribute income and benefits up to the top of the heap and take it away from the...
No question.
And, the important thing is to try to undo some of these little ratchets that distribute it up to the top.
Well, the whole system is built to do that.
Yeah, well, we can unbuild it, and that's... if we want to save the economy, we have to undo all of these little ratchets that kill jobs down at the bottom and suck the goodies up to the top of the heap. Patterson is afraid to...
Governor, you mean?
Yeah, he doesn't want to raise taxes on the rich. He'd rather cut benefits to the poor.
What do you think? What do you think? Ravi Bhatta, I just on the phone with him again, a couple of days ago, and he's still thinking we should have a wealth tax. I mean, 90%. Paul Krugman, who won the Nobel Prize in economics recently and everything, had an article he was showing, I don't know, from certain years, 2003, 2008, the benefits, income, wealth that went to the the benefits really didn't go even to the upper 1% of the population. It went to the upper 1%. 1/10 of 1% did get kind of some growth, but the vast majority of all the growth and wealth and income went to the upper 1/100th of 1% of the population of the United States of America. That's how rigged the system got to be. And it might leave room for a wealth tax that could be done without devastating effect upon those people who probably wouldn't miss it even if half of their billions were taken away. What do you think about that?
Well, we have a perfectly good wealth tax in this country already, though it's full fallen into somewhat disregard, namely a property tax. A property tax is a tax on property. About half of the property tax is drawn from corporate property, and 60+% of people own their own houses, or in most cases the bank owns most of that. But property ownership, whether through corporate shares or you're owning your local real estate, is much more concentrated than income.
Oh, yes, no doubt about that.
And there's been
more important actually in the long run.
So localities, states used to rely on statewide property taxes. Most states don't have phased that out in favor of income taxes, and that's too bad because that's where the wealth is. So Patterson is worried about, and I think unnecessarily worried about, rich people will leave New York if we raise their taxes.
Yeah, and they won't invest, and they won't create their jobs. They don't create anyway. They're just going to be all automated, those big systems and so forth.
Well, one of the things that is that if you look at some of the statistics, rich people tend to live where the taxes are high. Guess what? Because that's where the services and amenities are better.
All right. Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
So, I think, that's baloney that he can't raise taxes on the rich and has to cut services for the poor.
Well, think about it throughout all of history. Back to Roman times, and you had emperors, and then you had the serfs, and you had slaves, didn't you? Even in Athens, even in Periclean Athens, you had slaves. It was built on slaves. So we've been living in slave systems for a very long time, where there were all kinds of rationalizations for why these guys got to live in a big castle on a hill with moats and alligators in them around to protect them against the people who are wallowing around in the mud. So there's a lot of people who get it that they're really being very generous to us by allowing, that kind of thing, and the benefits flow down from them. And that's part of the psychology that's been built into hundreds and thousands of years of human evolution, living in unjust systems under power arrangements that were elementally unjust. Anything changed to make it possible so that maybe there could be a real, Mr. Obama talks about change, major change, existential, liberation, end time, something like that. There would be something that can make a break with the historical patterns that we are ensconced within and are now outdated by the zeitgeist, as it were. I don't want to use the term, but by the reality beyond just that we perceive within the historical limitations of the institutions within which we interaccommodate. Some sort of vision thing. Or something.
Well, let's hope that Obama, but something, there was a lot accomplished under Roosevelt in terms of, Social Security.
Absolutely.
But one of the most important things actually happened during World War II, and you don't hear too much about it now, but there was, because of the draft or the volunteers, there was a tremendous investment in training and education of the soldiers.
Under dint of wartime conditions. That's what got us out of the Depression.
And followed, and followed up by the VA, the GI Bill that sent folks to college, that helped them get their mortgages.
Absolutely.
And you know what happened?
Marshall Plan. There were all kinds of things of enlightenment.
But the thing is, we had a peak of inequality in 1929, and then inequality came down, sort of, in the 30s.
Now it's back up again.
And then following World War II, it plummeted to a low of in around about 1973, in which, as far as the statistics go, we were the most equal around about 1973 that we have ever been.
Do you think Walter
And then
Heller,
we started going back up again.
Yeah, with Mr. Reagan coming in the wings. And Mr. Heller advised Mr. Kennedy on a tax cut that got to the people a great deal of that, rather than going. And Mr. Bush's tax cut got practically everything went to the upper 1% of the population.
But, during World War II and following, we had very, very high marginal tax rates, 90% rates on the rich. And the economy boomed after World War II. So who says high tax rates are bad? I don't think so. And the tax rates have been coming down, and the privileges have been going up. And I think that's, that's why after coming down to this low in '73, the inequality has gone back up again,
right,
because
yeah.
the system has been re-rigged in favor of the top.
Well, down
but it doesn't have to be that way,
right.
because we undid a lot of it during World War II and the years following.
Okay, that's right. And we got some things. And now we got Mr. Madoff. Isn't that something? He made off with all the money, and that's really something that has been there. And the disrespect for the system, or the upset within the general population, is so great as we encounter this thing. They say down in Missouri and other parts of the South, I understand, you got to hit a mule upside the head to get its attention.
Right.
Well, they've gotten the attention of, they've hit the mule of the world economy upside the head, and it's a time when, radical ideas or thoughts of a real radical transformation, rather than just drifting along with what seemed to be working in a marginal kind of way and everything, might be in the wind.
Well,
so that might make it time to revisit Mr. George, Henry George. You got the school going here, you got the Schachenbach Center, and that kind of stuff, and it'd be good for people to go back and revisit them in terms to get curriculum for bringing suggestions of radical change. Mr. Obama run on the word change, not just muddle through.
Well, I would hope so. I mean, the Georgists correctly predicted this crash or whatever it is. I mean, because they knew the history of the Roaring '20s and how the collapse of land values pulled down the banks, and so they saw this one coming. Yeah,
Santiago who said if you don't learn from history, you're condemned to repeat its mistakes.
Messrs. Case and Schiller, who put out the Case-Schiller Housing Index, are very much influenced by George, too, and they've been watching those land values.
Well, then that's the thing that to be visited. So, and you come back from, what was it? We only got about a minute left, okay? We've gone through 58 minutes of great talk and everything. What was the feeling of the 12,000 colleagues you met with in San Francisco? Maybe you can take us out by describing some of that. What's their, are they optimistic, pessimistic for the human prospect?
Well, most of the colleagues out there were looking for jobs.
Yeah, right.
And which is not a very good prospect at the moment for newly minted PhDs.
Yeah, right.
Actually, I mostly go to the history of thought sessions. I'm very much interested in economics, where it came from. For instance,
the big picture, maybe. Huh?
Well, who were the personalities? What was their background? Why did the Chicago School come up with this whole pattern of saying that monopoly is minimal, so we can count on the free market? Who were the players in all of that?
Friedman, I guess, the
Friedman,
Chicago
but
boys.
it was the whole Chicago School.
Yeah, have you seen Naomi Klein's book? Have you read it?
No, I don't know that.
Okay, you maybe want to. Yeah, she's written very well.
Oh, Naomi Klein.
Naomi
sure.
Klein.
Yeah. I saw that. I think she's a bit overboard,
Friedman.
but she's very impressive.
Yeah, she's very impressive and very critiques the Friedman model. And it's no longer cool to be rich. It used to be cool to be. It's no longer cool.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. Now maybe the rich will be ready to give up to pay. I'm a part of a group called Responsible Wealth,
yes,
and we are organizing to have a protest if Patterson doesn't raise our taxes.
All right, good. Okay, listen, so good to see you,
okay,
Polly.
Thanks,
Give my
Harold.
very best to Tom.
Will do.
Yeah, and everything.
Okay.
And thank you for viewing. Your pleasure. Polly Cleveland, a Georgist and an economist and a human being of the highest orders you've been able to see. Happy to be able to welcome her to conversation. We invite you to come in. We'll be tuning in again tomorrow. Polly, thanks a lot for everything, for such a very, 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 very well-led life.
Oh, well, thank you.
Which continues. Thank you for viewing. We'll see you tomorrow. So, just touch the surface of a lot of different things. I still like Kelso and Fuller, but then you get into old habits, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I find George very interesting. And Pi.